German gold may no longer truly be German. This is the paradox that Berlin quietly fears. Germany is one of the richest and most prudent countries in the world, yet a vast portion of its national wealth is not located within its borders. It is locked away in foreign vaults, thousands of miles away, beyond any direct control. For decades, no one worried about it. Today, that certainty is starting to crack. Not because of theft, not because of a financial collapse, but because of a much more disturbing question. What happens when geopolitical trust disappears? The facts are clear. Germany holds the second largest gold reserves in the world, valued at around $450 billion, and roughly 37% of that gold, around 1,236 tons, is stored in the Federal Reserve's vaults in New York. This detail changes everything because that gold is not merely an economic guarantee. It is a lever of power. And when officials begin to publicly ask whether it is still safe to leave it there, the real story is only just beginning. What is at stake here goes far beyond a simple issue of gold storage. Officially, nothing has been decided yet. There are no formal announcements, no set timelines, no armored convoys leaving New York. But it is precisely this that makes the situation concerning. The debate has moved from the fringes to the heart of German power. The trigger is clear in its content. The rising tensions between the European Union and the United States, trade wars, sanctions, and increasingly aggressive political rhetoric. This is not an isolated incident. It is a recurring theme. For decades, Berlin considered Washington to be a stable and predictable partner. Today, that assumption is being openly questioned. And here is the real question that few dare to ask aloud. If gold is meant to be the ultimate safeguard in times of crisis, what value does it have if it depends on the goodwill of another state? This is where the story begins to shift, and what follows surprises even the most cautious circles in Berlin. A statement is now openly circulating in Berlin. Keeping this gold abroad has become a strategic risk. It is no longer a marginal rumor. It is being said publicly. Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann, chair of the European Parliament's Security and Defense Committee, has explicitly called for bringing the gold back from the United States and urged the government to act swiftly. This simple fact is crucial. Until recently, such a statement would have been unthinkable in the dominant political discourse. But notice what stands out here. She is not talking about financial speculation or abstract theory. She is talking about control, sovereignty, and time is running out. Within the same political space, Chancellor Merz chooses his words with extreme caution. In the Bundestag, he reminds that EU countries are, I quote, partners and allies of the United States, not subordinates. Note what he does not deny. He does not say that the gold is safe. He does not say that the risk does not exist. He speaks of political relations, not concrete guarantees, and this is precisely where the tension begins to rise. As this question progresses, the frame of reference begins to shift. What was once considered a prudent measure gradually becomes an uncomfortable dependency. Historically, keeping German gold in New York had a cold and rational logic. During the Cold War, Germany was divided, vulnerable, and deeply dependent on American protection. Storing gold abroad guaranteed access to the dollar to global liquidity and offered assurance in case of conflict on European soil. At the time, no one questioned this choice. But here comes the turning point. The world in which this structure was conceived no longer exists. Germany is reunified. Europe is no longer a potential battleground between military blocs. And yet, the gold is still elsewhere. What has changed is not only the geography, it is the normalization of a troubling fact. A vital part of Germany's economic sovereignty remains contingent upon the political stability of another country. This is where history repeats itself, but in a different form. And this repetition is starting to worry those who thought this model was eternal. Then comes the argument that shifts the debate from mere political unease to a strategic alert. It does not come from a marginal opponent, but from within Germany's economic apparatus itself. Emanuel Monk, a leading economist and former head of research at the Bundesbank, publicly states that keeping such a large portion of the national wealth in the United States has become too risky. His reasoning is straightforward. He observes that geopolitics has changed and strategic dependence on Washington is no longer compatible with German interests. In his words, repatriating the gold would be a step towards greater strategic independence. And this discourse is not isolated. Michael Jaeger, president of the European Taxpayers Association, goes further. He asks a simple yet destabilizing question. In a serious political confrontation, could Germany actually access its gold? He points to Trump's unpredictability, his obsession with economic leverage, and even his provocative statements on seizing Greenland. From that point onwards, gold is no longer a passive asset. It becomes a potential tool of pressure. And this realization definitively alters the reading of the entire issue. And this is where the dynamic accelerates sharply. As this debate unfolds in Germany, several red lines have already been crossed elsewhere. The European Union has seized around $300 billion in Russian sovereign assets, an act presented as exceptional, but which sends a clear signal. In times of confrontation, the rules can change very quickly. Simultaneously, transatlantic relations are becoming more transactional, harder, and more unpredictable. At the same time, in Germany, the argument that international law protects everyone is losing its strength. Even within traditionally moderate parties, the question is no longer whether the risk exists, but how much it is being underestimated. And observe the speed. What was recently labeled extremist discourse is now openly discussed by centrist officials, recognized economists, and prominent elected representatives. The pressure is mounting without an official announcement, without a dramatic break, but with a rapid accumulation of worrying signals. Each individual element seems manageable. Together, they form a scenario of losing control. And the question becomes impossible to avoid. What happens if this dynamic continues? At this point, the story stops being abstract and starts to concern you directly. Because this debate about gold is not a dispute between diplomats or economists locked away in meeting rooms. It touches something much more concrete: security, stability, and the real cost of decisions made far from the public. If this gold is meant to be the ultimate safety net in case of a major crisis, then its location matters. It influences a country's ability to react quickly, to protect its currency, to reassure its citizens. And when this guarantee depends on an unpredictable partner, this risk inevitably trickles down to the population. Inflation becomes harder to contain. Political maneuvers are restricted. Decisions are made in haste rather than choice. This is not an ideological question. It is a question of daily vulnerability. What changes today is that these concerns are no longer confined to closed circles of power. They are beginning to filter into public debate. And if this situation seems familiar to you, if you feel like you've seen this kind of dependency become a problem elsewhere, let me know in the comments, because this collective unease is rarely a coincidence. To understand why this situation is becoming possible, you have to look at the mechanism, not the statements. No system relies solely on trust. It relies on incentives, power dynamics, and habits that eventually seem normal. For a long time, American dominance made this dependency invisible. As long as the system was stable, no one really paid attention to where the levers were. But today, the landscape is changing. Power is becoming more transactional. Alliances are constantly being tested. And every strategic asset, even one sitting still in a vault, takes on new meaning. Gold stored abroad is not only protected, it is also exposed to the political decisions of the host country. This is not a theory. It is a direct consequence of how sanctions, seizures, and economic pressures are now used as tools of foreign policy. What is troubling is the normalization of this logic. Once a precedent exists, it becomes a model. And in this model, the question is no longer, is it legal, but is it possible? This is where the system reveals its fragility, and it is also where the trajectory begins to accelerate towards something much more unstable. From here, two paths emerge, and neither is theoretical. The first is slower, more discreet. Germany maintains the status quo, avoids confrontation, and continues to treat this dependency as an acceptable compromise. In this scenario, nothing happens until one day something does. A new political crisis, a trade escalation, a unilateral decision made elsewhere. And suddenly, what was tolerable becomes an emergency. The other path is riskier in the short term, but more readable. Berlin chooses to pose the question officially, not necessarily to repatriate the gold immediately, but to test the limits. And this is where the reactions matter more than the answers. A refusal, a delay, a condition imposed. Each of these signals would reveal the reality of the power dynamics. But here's the key point. Even without a formal decision, the mere fact that this discussion is now public changes the dynamic. Markets are watching, allies are watching, and above all, other countries are watching. Because if Germany, a symbol of stability, begins to doubt, then the question spreads. It is no longer a bilateral matter. It is the start of a movement. And in this kind of sequence, the next step always happens faster than one thinks. And this is where everything closes in. This story is not really about gold bars stacked beneath Manhattan. It speaks of an invisible threshold that Germany and perhaps all of Europe is beginning to approach. For decades, economic sovereignty has been delegated without question because the system seemed to function. Today, that comfort is disappearing. One sentence sums it all up. When a strategic asset depends on another power, it ceases to be neutral. The gold hasn't moved, the vaults haven't been opened, but the perception has changed, and this is often where ruptures begin. Once political elites begin to publicly ask what happens in the event of a major disagreement, there is no going back. This question does not disappear. It returns stronger at the next shock. And the real unknown is not whether Germany will repatriate its gold, but what this will reveal about the true state of Western alliances. Because this debate is just the surface. The layer beneath it is much deeper. And it is precisely this layer that we will explore next. If you want to understand where all of this is leading and why such debates always emerge just before a major shift, subscribe to ensure you don't miss the next part.